Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched Mobile Suit Gundam 1, or Mobile Suit Gundam the movie. I'm honestly not sure what to call this. Um, so, Gundam. um, Mecha anime and mecha in general is something I have talked about before and am fascinated by, but my depth of knowledge is not that substantial. And Gundam in particular is an area that I have to admit up front I have neither the knowledge base nor the time to adequately explore. Gundam itself is such a cultural touchstone, especially in Japan, but internationally as well, that I cannot possibly talk about it properly. Um, that that is doubled down by the fact that the only Gundam I've ever watched is the original series, 0079 or Gundam 79 or any of the other names that has gone by many, many times. And I watched it years and years ago. And I watched the original release of the original series in Japanese with the subtitles. I've never watched the dub, and I've never watched the movies. So Gundam and Gunpla has come up a couple of times in conversation over the last few months in general and last few weeks in particular, and so I found out that the Gundam movies are on Netflix, which I happen to have. So I thought, let's see what this is like. The first Gundam movie, this movie, is essentially a re-edit of the part of the original series, Gundam 79. It seems like it's the first 14 episodes. I believe there are 43 episodes in the original series, and it's cut down to about 2 hours. And it's hard to understate the importance of this movie as a cultural thing, but it's also somehow a movie that doesn't even warrant its own like Wikipedia entry. It's just a sub entry on the page for the series. And I kind of get it and I kind of don't. And part of the reason I wanted to talk about this one is because I think it warrants a little bit of interrogation, both in the context and outside of the context of the original series. I am going to talk about this basically as I'm going to feel free to talk about the elements of the movie because and spoil things as needed. I don't think there's a huge amount to spoil in the first place, but it's hard to talk about without being able to be pretty free talking about the elements. So, I like I said, I watched the original series many years ago, and it has stuck in my head as being notable, but and I may get crucified for this one, not particularly good. I'm sure at the time it was incredible, but it did not age very well in a whole bunch of ways. Not the least of which is just it's hard to rate the series fairly simply because it set so many standards and or established the frameworks for things that would come later that there's no possible way for a modern viewer watching it for the first time to judge it fairly. And I have to concede that up front. This was not the beginning of anime by any means, of animated media in Japan, but it is incredibly important um, as far as broadening its popularity, both inside and outside of Japan. And the movie apparently is largely responsible for that. The original series apparently did not do particularly well when it aired on TV. And this was not the first mecha anime. This was not the first anime in general. It was just sort of still a very niche thing. But when the movies released, their popularity was extremely substantial. And that was heightened by the fact that they had, after the release of the original series, started making the Gunpla models, which are incredibly popular to this day. So it's hard to rate this completely fairly. It's also hard to talk about it without talking about things that took massive influence from it, including things like Transformers in the West. Transformers is a different beast altogether because, cynically, Transformers is basically an ad for toys and always has been. Gundam is not, or at least wasn't originally, and generally seems to have a genuine interest in making good media rather than just shilling for toys. And I think that's highlighted by the fact that the Gunpla models didn't come out until a year or more, I think, after the original series. And that the popularity of the franchise in general and the movies in particular didn't come until the movies came out. So the movie is really interesting to me for a variety of reasons, including having, to my mind, fixed for a modern viewer some of the elements that do not modernize particularly well about the original series. The original series being 40 some odd episodes, 43 episodes, I'm pretty sure, is unusual. And at least for modern anime or modern TV viewing, 43 episodes is a lot of episodes for a single series. And that's a lot of footage to make in the first place. And in 1979, when it was releasing, they're doing it, in the traditional fashion with traditional cell production, all that sort of thing. So it's a lot of footage. Now, admittedly, I've talked about this before. A lot of that means that they will reuse footage, they reuse cells, that sort of thing, to sort of cut costs where they need to. Sometimes that's not that noticeable. Sometimes it's very noticeable. But the point that I was getting to about there being 43 episodes is they had to break it up into 3 movies of over 2 hours each. And it still drags a little bit. Now, my personal opinion is that the least approachable part of the original series is it's slow, incredibly slow. And sometimes it's appropriately slow, sometimes it takes its time, but often it just sort of futzes around for a while, and it really cripples the pacing of the show in general. Again, it's been years since I've watched it now, but I vaguely remember there being basically whole episodes that felt like they could be a waste of time. At the same time, this movie tackles, the series attempts to tackle some very heavy subjects. This is fundamentally a series about war and about sometimes the very brutal realities of war. The beginning of the show, the beginning of this movie, is a military attack on a, a primarily civilian facility, and shows, not gruesomely, but it shows the deaths of many civilians, their bodies just piled. It doesn't, it tries to keep some certain standards, like not showing outright gore, but there's no getting around what it was trying to do, which is to show a somewhat honest portrayal of, these are the costs of war, these are the people who are harmed by it, so on and so forth. At the same time, the series and this movie are sometimes disappointing in the lack of true interrogation of the subjects they raise. Our main character, Amuro, is thrust into a scenario where he takes it upon himself to pilot the RX-78 Gundam, in what seems like partially an act of desperation, partially an act of childlike belief in goodness and a want to protect the things that matter to him, so on and so forth. And in a lot of anime series that would proceed and follow this, the typical route for a character like that is for them to have a series of empowering events that make them believe more and more in their righteousness, their abilities, and their heroic nature. Amuro, by comparison, is not a very heroic character. Not necessarily because he is like falls to the realities of being a human being and has particularly awful behaviors or thoughts or whatever, but he's a more realistic portrayal of a kid, or a person in general, but especially like a 15 or 16-year-old kid thrust into the realities of combat and being directly confronted with the horrors of knowing that you just ended the life of another person, even if that was somebody who wanted to kill you, that and wished you ill, and wished all of your friends and family and everybody around you harm. The realities of bringing lives to an end, especially in brutal ways, is traumatizing. It would be traumatizing to anyone, but especially to a child with basically no figures of authority around him, who has been already living in a situation where he is unusually independent, at least by I should note, by a Western standard, he's unusually independent for a child of his age. Japanese social culture and society in general puts a little bit more freedom in a lot of younger people's hands to take care of themselves, but we won't delve into that. But in a scenario where he feels relatively self-sufficient, he then believes himself to be capable of taking on these newfound responsibilities in a wartime, and he suffers dramatically for it, and the people around him suffer as well. They suffer their own problems, and they suffer as a result of him, because being traumatized causes you to behave in unusual and negative ways, even towards people who are important to you. And a lot of the series interrogates, sort of, at least at a very surface level, what are the ramifications of bringing the negativity of your combat experience, your wartime job, back to people who don't deserve to suffer, who you care about, but then you bring it back to them, and they have to deal with it. This is a very roundabout way of me saying that both in the original series and the movie, it paints a very direct picture of the struggles of various characters, especially Amuro, but does not really delve deeply into the psychology behind it, or make a substantial effort to force the character to actually interrogate that for themselves. For the most part, the deepest it gets is sort of like these ugly exchanges between characters who are ostensibly friends, where the realities of their world are driving them to not be as nice to each other, or not be as thoughtful or kind or whatever, because they're all suffering. But that's sort of as far as it goes in terms of, and the rest is subtextual. Again, it's hard not to start comparing this to other things that followed, even things that might be considered critiques of the genre in general, and basically anything that in anime that critiques mecha is critiquing Gundam inherently in some way. So compared to something like Neon Genesis Evangelion, which is a whole thing, and is very much about psychology, this is much more sort of a sci-fi reinterpretation of a typical wartime story, a more classical wartime narrative. So I got way. I'm just going to ramble on this. It's because it's hard not to talk about all of the context that surrounds this. The movie is very well produced. I have to give it that. And for all of the corners cut and reuse of footage and concessions made in the original series to make it feasible to produce such a sort of epic story, it condenses down pretty well to a movie. I was not expecting, I had never watched it before, because I fully expected the movie to read like a clip show. More like a recap episode, at the beginning of a new series or something like that. But it actually does quite a good job of condensing the content down into a reasonably well paced, or at least not worse paced than the original series, movie that encompasses all of the necessary plot beats, and doesn't lose too much in the process. In a way, I think that's sort of a validation of my feelings and a continued critique on the original series. While it's been a while since I watched the original series, and I could not compare them side by side, the movie and the original series, I don't recall substantial elements or substantial plot lines from the original series being significantly cut from the movie, which is kind of damning if you can condense like whatever it is, like 12 hours into 2 hours. Is that right? I don't actually remember how long the episodes are. But 14 episodes into a 2-hour movie is a substantial amount of cutting. So it's interesting. it's interesting that they're able to eliminate that much and still manage not to make it feel like a clip show that just hits on the major plot beats to make sure that you've kept the key plot in mind just so you can get to the next thing. That said, it still has a lot of the same issues. Even after, I believe this is a remastered version of the stuff, but how much do I want to talk about the technical aspects? I'll just skim over this. Reprocessing a traditionally animated piece of media is basically impossible. It's a Herculean undertaking, if it's possible at all, because often, especially in Japanese animation, the cells and the original drawings are not saved. They were disposed of, considered to be sort of an intermediate product, which is why some people put such a premium on owning an original cell, because they're, especially for older stuff, are incredibly rare. So it's oftentimes completely impossible to reprocess, at least in the traditional way, a piece of older animation. You have to work with the existing print as it was put onto film. Hopefully it was film, and use modern methods to clean that up as much as possible. For better or for worse, I think this preserves a lot of the qualities of the original. Again, for better or for worse, because sometimes that means there are frames that are off color, or scenes that are off color, things that are fuzzy, things that are misaligned. Like I said, reuse of footage. There's a lot of sort of janky elements. And there are other productions from this era that have survived a lot better. But because it's being cut from a somewhat budget-oriented, very extended series, I think, would it be disingenuous to not reproduce it in its most original form, even after remastering it? Would it be inappropriate to try and recolor or color grade frames, or to take out some of the jitter from misalignment, or to remaster the audio or re-record audio? I don't know. I think it's kind of debatable. I'm also just generally surprised that they were able to find a place in the arc to break it pretty cleanly. Now, I'm not going to say you wouldn't be a little bit frustrated with the cliffhanger that the movie is ended on. But I think there is still a reasonably satisfying narrative arc throughout the movie that gives a proper hook for interest in watching it further. I don't think there was I don't know. There may or may not have been a recorded recorded distribution of the original series at the time the movie released. So I don't know whether or not it was possible to watch this movie and then try and go get the original series to watch that, or if it was only on broadcast. But the second movie of the three came out, I think, a few months later. So, for fans, that would have been a substantial boon to be able to see that relatively soon. And I think with the place that this movie ends on, I think that would be very necessary. If you made somebody wait an entire year or more to find out more information, I don't think this is a good place to end the movie. I am very curious, and I will probably end up watching the other two, whether or not I make a movie on them, or a video on them, is down to whether there's something of particular note, unique, that I'm not talking about here, that's worth talking about. I'm curious, knowing the arc of the series, whether there isn't a more satisfying place to cut the second movie about 2/3 through. Because obviously with the ups and downs of pacing a TV show in general, and with the existing pacing issues in the original series, I can imagine some places where there would be a very satisfying climax and then flow into the next one, or I could imagine them dropping it on a very, very high cliffhanger. And which one they decide to do, or how they manage to do that, is I'll be curious about. As I understand it, all three of these movies also have additional animation that was additional footage that was made specifically for the movies. This is not a complete recut. I could not tell you what's new, but what I guess that's really just to say that whatever they wove into it with new footage is seamlessly put together. Does not stand out in any significant way. And while I'm no expert, and I'm sure somebody who is a big fan of the series could immediately point out, oh, that's not in the series, I could not. So I think that's in its favor. This is an interesting movie, and I don't know. Gundam is one of those things that is such a behemoth in media that I don't know that I've always been scared to approach it in a way. There are dozens of different series released over the course of 40 some odd years at this point. 44 years, 43 years, I don't know, 46 years. I can't do math right now. My brain's fried. There are so many things to watch, and there are so many fans, and there are so many different. There are so many. Well, there are different timelines and things like that, and people have different opinions on what's the best one, or what order you should watch them in, or which ones you should skip. So it's kind of like a scary prospect, but this makes me interested in trying to delve back into it again. Maybe try one of the UC shows or something like that. One of the newer ones. And it's really curious to me, and I find mecha as okay. Let me step back for a second. Mecha is not a genre in and of itself. And actually there's an interesting discussion to be had about how how Gundam was deliberately supposed to sort of not be a super robot series, where Super Robot is more about super, I don't want to say supernatural, but it's about a much crazier, less practical version of mecha, where Gundam, at least in the original series, is supposed to be very grounded in a sort of practical reality, practical future reality, whereas other mecha shows tend to fall closer to the super robot genre, where their practicality is thrown out the window in favor of a lot more of like the fantastical elements of it, and that can be portrayed in a variety of ways. How did I end up talking about that? I really like mechs. They're really interesting because they themselves are not particularly defining of a genre, but because there are so many things you can do with it. And if you haven't already, and you have the time, you've already watched this video, you might as well go check out my Dissecting the Frog video on mechs. I have other topics for that series that I need to bring up at some point, but those videos are a really big undertaking. But that's a long video that I was pretty happy with having made, and delves into the really specific practical things about mechs as a general thing. Gundam scares me. Like I want to get into it. I want to get into more mech stuff in general, and Gundam in particular, although don't tell anybody, I kind of like Macross better. But Gundam's really interesting. I'd like to learn more about it, and maybe this is the kick to make me go try more of it again. Anyway, at this point, I'm rambling. Like I said, maybe I'll come back to this. I may or may not talk about the other two films if and when I go watch them, or maybe we'll come back to Gundam in general in a different way. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been your host, the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.